Have you ever had one of those shows or movies that you watched only once a long time ago and have a very vague memory of, but remember almost nothing about from when you saw it? And I'm not talking about, say, a show that you remember watching a few times as a kid that you distinctly remember the name and premise of, and can recall the plots of a couple episodes and or a handful of characters. No, I'm talking about a show or movie that you only saw one time, literally just once, but you can only recall literally one or two things about from when you saw it. And then years later, when you learn about the show again, you go, hang on a second, this seems vaguely familiar. Have I seen this before? Oh yeah, I think I've seen this before. I really don't remember anything about it, but I'm like 80% sure I saw it when I was in elementary school. I'm sure if you think long enough, you can come up with some memory watching a show or movie like that. Possibly a show or movie that you've been lucky enough to since rewatched. Well, today, I'm going to be talking about a show that perfectly fits that description for me, and one that I've been itching to rewatch and review since it came out of my mind a couple months ago. Without further ado, let's talk about McGee and Me. Created by Ken C. Johnson and Bill Myers, McGee and Me is a Christian live-action animated hybrid series funded by Focus on the Family and produced by Tyndale Productions. The show stars Nick Martin, an 11-year-old boy whose family recently moved to Eastfield, Indiana to live with his grandmother. Nick is a creative boy who likes to draw and wants to be an artist or cartoonist when he grows up. The show follows Nick in his everyday life going to school, dealing with family and friends, and learning important morals on how to make the right decisions, like the good book says. McGee and Me premiered in 1989 and lasted for 12 episodes, plus one special. Like I said, I have a very vague memory of seeing the show at least 15 years ago. I think I remember seeing the show's title sequence when I was at church. The pastor had likely put on an episode for me and my fellow elementary school age kids to watch. The only thing I really remembered about the show itself was it had a little animated character in a live action environment, although I remember the character's name being McGillicuddy instead of McGee. I must have misremembered or mixed it up with something else. But now that I've had the chance to rewatch the show years after the fact, what exactly do I think of it? Well, let's take a look and see. Right up front, one thing I need to emphasize about the show before I say anything else about it is that it is a Christian show. I mentioned I remember seeing the show's title sequence at church, and yeah, that definitely wasn't a coincidence. Similar to VeggieTales, McGee and Me is a Christian show targeted towards kids in Christian households, with episodes frequently being sold at Christian bookstores. In fact, before VeggieTales came along, McGee and Me actually was considered to be the #1 Christian kids show. Every single episode of the show does contain at least a few mentions or references to God, Jesus, the Bible, praying, etc. I mention all this because I do want any potential new viewers to be aware of what the show is at its basis. If you're the kind of secular individual who gets put off by explicit references to religion and media, this show might not be for you. I'm not saying that non-Christians can't enjoy the show. I mean, VeggieTales was able to get a secular audience after all. But I am saying the show's primary demographic is Christian kids. I would say that McGee and Me isn't its slightly older kids than VeggieTales was, like I'd say a TVY7 audience, but still, it does have a bit of a niche target demographic. All that being said, however, the show isn't overly preachy or pushy. It's not like they mention God every 2 minutes. The religious aspect is definitely there, but I wouldn't say it's woven into the show's fiber. Let me go over the plot of the show's first episode, The Big Lie, to demonstrate what I mean. The episode starts out with Nick reading a passage from the Bible. This is actually something that happens at the beginning of several episodes, before the actual story begins. After the Bible passage ends, the story starts with Nick getting ready for his first day at his new school. After a rough first day, he ends up running into the school bully and his gang. He nearly gets beaten up, but is saved by another kid whom he befriends. When Nick and his new friend are going home from school, Nick's friend tells him about a crazy Indian who lives in an old rundown house not far from Nick's house. Apparently he eats live animals, nothing that goes in ever comes out. Wanting to make a good first impression at school, Nick approaches the house despite his friend's warning. He accidentally falls into the cellar, but manages to escape just before he's caught. After he escapes and is asked about his encounter, Nick exaggerates what he saw. A rumor begins to spread at school about the encounter, but Nick makes no effort to explain what really happened. That evening, he overhears his grandmother dispelling the rumors about the house's owner. She explains that George Ravenhill, the man's real name, is actually a very nice man who heals injured animals, and that his house is run down due to having severe arthritis and not being able to get around much. Nick then begins to feel guilty about withholding the truth, and after a conversation with his dad, he decides it's finally time to set things right. Shortly after, the school bully and his gang break into the house to damage and vandalize it, as well as release all the injured animals. After overhearing that this is happening, Nick runs to the house to try and stop them, but by the time he gets there, he's too late. George Ravenhill, whom as it turns out his grandmother was right about all along, forgives Nick, but as punishment for what happened, Nick has to clean up his entire house and learns the lesson that you should always tell the truth. Now, if you were to edit out all the lines in the actual story after Nick reads a Bible passage that mention God or Jesus, which I say totals to about 1 minute, the story would pretty much be the same. In fact, this particular episode actually did air on ABC in 1992, with the explicitly Christian references edited out to make it more appropriate for a secular audience. If you could overlook those explicitly religious lines, what you're left with is a story about a kid learns that lying can get you and or someone else in big trouble. That is a genuinely good moral and one that's important for kids to learn. Honestly, most of the morals in the show do work for a secular audience. Be careful what you watch, stand up for others, don't be jealous of someone else, etc. Again, ignoring the Bible passage readings at the beginning and the occasional live dialogue where someone says something religious, these episodes still function fine without them. Although there are a couple of morals that are more explicitly religious. One of these is from the episode Twister and Shout. In that episode, Nick's parents leave for the weekend while Nick, his older sister, and two of his friends who are sleeping over are on their own. A huge storm ends up rolling in and a tornado starts heading their way, leaving everyone feeling afraid. They end up remembering that actually they're not alone and that there's no need to be afraid because God is watching out for them. Yeah, that moral doesn't really work for a secular audience. By the way, this is the most religious episode of the whole show. If you're a non-Christian and you can watch this episode without any issue, then watching the rest of the show is a piece of cake. The other episode with an explicitly religious moral is Take Me Out of the Ball Game. In that episode, Nick's baseball team, the Eastfield Braves, has an upcoming game against the Freeman Dodgers. And Nick puts his faith in the team's new pitcher winning them a victory, and his dad puts faith in the team itself winning the game. They end up learning the moral about idolization and misplaced faith, and that having faith in God is more important than having faith in the team winning. Again, that's not really a moral you can write for a secular audience. Plus, it's not that big of a deal the team loses isn't a very compelling moral. Those two episodes aside, I honestly could see a non-Christian enjoying the show despite its Christian influences. This show does have other merits as well, which I'll talk about in a bit. So yeah, this isn't just a sermon disguised as a show. It is a show that just so happens to contain Christian values. Oh gosh, get that away from me! Also, despite being a Christian show, it's not pushing any sort of religious agenda or viewpoint. This isn't one of those anti-evolution, the Earth is only 6,000 years old, Noah's flood really happened sorts of things. Like VeggieTales, the show's primary goal is teaching kids some sort of biblically based moral, and that's really it. Those of you who might be afraid that this show is some sort of fundamentalist indoctrination propaganda, don't need to worry. This show is clearly meant to be enjoyed by Christians of all denominations, whether they believe the Bible is 100% literal or not. But okay, putting aside the religious and moral aspects of the show, what else does it have to offer? Let's start out by talking about our show's protagonist and narrator, Nick Martin. Nick is the character that the kids watching the show are supposed to see themselves in the shoes of, learning the lesson Nick learns alongside him. On that, Nick serves his purpose pretty well. He's not a bad kid at heart, but sometimes he does do something that he shouldn't, or lets his desires or ambitions go to his head. I'm sure many kids watching the show can recall a time when they were in a similar situation Nick was in and find the episode relatable due to having learned the same lesson. Hopefully some kids learn to not end up in a similar situation Nick got into by watching a certain episode and learning its moral. As for his hobbies and interests, like I said, he likes drawing and wants to be an artist or cartoonist when he grows up. He is a very talented artist, and he does utilize his drawing skills a few times in the show, like when he enters a poster contest and draws a poster for the Eastfield Winter Carnival, or when a drawing he submits gets him selected as a contestant for a game show. In addition to drawing, he also has a knack for tinkering and inventing things, such as the Rube Goldberg contraption seen in the show's title sequence that's just a pencil sharpener, or lights that turn off when you whistle, or a door lock that unlocks when you shine a light onto a solar panel near the door, etc. Nick is a very creative boy, and showcasing that not just with his drawings, but with his contraptions does make him a more interesting main character. Next up, we have the show's title character and comic relief, McGee. McGee is Nick's OC, a cartoon character that he created and frequently draws. Unbeknownst to any human besides Nick, McGee can come to life and can talk to and interact with Nick.
Here's looking at you, kid.
McGee, what are you doing?
First day of school, huh?
Yeah.
Cheer up, buckaroo. It's like I've always said. Make a big first impression and the rest is a piece of cake.
This is where the show being a live-action animated hybrid series comes into play. Although McGee and Me is primarily live-action for the most part, it does contain a character that is fully animated in the live-action environments. It sort of reminds me of the Disney Channel sitcom Lizzie McGuire, which came out a little over a decade later. That was another show that had a little animated character in it. In that show's case, an animated version of the title character who represented her inner thoughts. In McGee and Me, it's a bit different. The animated character here does still represent the main character's inner thoughts, but not quite in the same way as the animated Lizzie McGuire. For starters, Mickey isn't an animated version of Nick. He's just a cartoon character that Nick created. Secondly, in addition to being the show's comic relief, his other role in the show is to serve as Nick's conscience and imaginary friend. Another comparison I can make here is Jiminy Cricket for Pinocchio, a small character who serves as the conscience of the main character. McGee does generally give Nick good advice and tries to cheer him up whenever he's upset or down the dumps. Like Jiminy Cricket though, he's not perfect. Sometimes he does tell Nick to do something that he probably shouldn't that may end up getting him into trouble. Nick talking to McGee can be interpreted as Nick thinking to himself about the right thing to do versus the wrong thing to do. McGee's advice can be on either side of the fence, sort of a metaphor that Nick doesn't have a perfect conscience. I do like the fact that Nick's conscience is represented by an animated character. I feel like it conceptually makes sense for a kid who likes to draw and wants to be a cartoonist to have a cartoon character as his conscience. Of course, McGee himself isn't the only way in which we see the insights of Nick's mind. This show does contain some fully animated segments. These include the beginnings of several episodes where Nick reads a passage from the Bible, foreshadowing the moral he's going to learn by the end of the story, and McGee acts out the passage in his imagination. Most episodes also contain additional fully animated segments starring McGee, which also relates to the story or lesson in some way. Sometimes it's a continuation of the Bible passage Nick read before the story, sometimes it's a pop culture parody, sometimes it's Nick's dream. By the way, Nick's animated dream sequence in the episode A Star in the Breaking actually features him in the dream, a live-action character in the animated environment, sort of a reversal of McGee being an animated character in the live-action environments. Again, this does sort of fit conceptually with the idea that Nick himself is live-action, but everything that's in his mind, McGee, his imagination sequences, and his dreams, are all animated. Strangely though, his daydreams are live-action. These appear in the episodes Back to the Drawing Board and Take Me Out of the Ball Game. I guess it would have been too expensive to have these be fully animated, or maybe after his dream and A Star in the Breaking, they decided not to have Nick be live-action in the animated environment again. Another showcase of, nearly, everything in Nick's mind being animated is in the episode Do the Bright Thing. In that episode, we literally get to see inside Nick's mind and it's fully animated in there. In these segments, McGee breaks the fourth wall and shows the audience Nick's mind's control panel, which is how Nick makes decisions.
Hey, I know just what you need to relieve the old brain cells. Let's go to Roddy's Arcade and zap some aliens.
All right, Nick. Let's see if we can get a little more adequate data this time. Question.
Should I play video games now?
Options. A.
Is this good for me?
You got any more quarters?
I'm flat broke.
B.
What do my folks have to say?
Remember to be home by noon.
C.
What does the wise man say?
And the scripture says, honor and obey your father and mother.
And now, the verdict.
No way. An hour in there and I won't have enough money to buy a pencil, much less an art table. Besides, I'm supposed to be home by noon.
While I would say the character's mind is a control panel controlled by a little person or little people inside trope is a cliche that's been in plenty of media, this episode actually came out before all the other media I can think of with that trope, so I guess I give it a pass. By the way, this is the only episode where Nick doesn't narrate the story, or where McGee doesn't appear in the live-action environment at all, or directly converse with Nick. This is the show's formula breaker episode. Also, about 40% of this episode takes place in Nick's mind, making it the episode of the show with the most animation. Unless you count the special. I'll talk about that later. While I'm on the topic of the show's animation, it looks pretty good. It's fluent, vibrant, and makes good use of squash and stretch of many of the cartoony gags. I'm really glad for a show about an aspiring cartoonist talking to his cartoon imaginary friend, they decided to have the animation be on the cartoonier side. As for the live-action animation blending, it looks fine. This show premiered almost exactly 1 year after Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out, and while the live-action animation blending in this show obviously doesn't look quite as amazing as it did in that film, for a late 80s, early 90s series on a TV show budget, especially when they didn't have any network backing, it looks decent for what it is. The show does try to sell the illusion of there being a little 6-inch tall cartoon guy in the live-action world as much as it can by hiding the parts of him that are covered by a live-action object, or giving him a reflection on reflective surfaces. I actually think it looks better than Lizzie McGuire did. Now, it's not perfect. There are a couple times where McGee doesn't have a visible shadow, making it look like he's not actually standing or sitting on what he's supposed to, or when McGee's walking and the camera's moving but they're not synced up very well. The show also cheats a couple times by having a live-action object become animated when it interacts with McGee, and vice versa when it interacts with Nick. I'll also say it does a better job putting animation into a live-action environment than the other way around, if the dream sequence from A Star in the Breaking was any indication. Nick didn't blend with the animated environment very well, and it's obvious that he was just in front of a green screen. That being said, given that the animation in these scenes is from Nick's imagination, I think it's okay if it doesn't look 100% realistic. Even still, it certainly looks better than a couple of other live-action animated hybrid shows that came out about 2 or 3 decades later, which is kind of sad to be honest. I'm glad the show came out about a decade before Flash animation was invented. The show's animation was produced by Mike Jones Productions. Mike Jones himself had previously worked for a few studios during the late 70s to 80s, including Hanna-Barbera, Warner Bros., and Filmation, helping to produce shows such as the original My Little Pony, Jim Henson's Muppet Babies, Fraggle Rock the animated series, and the animated adaptations of Adventures in Odyssey, a Christian radio series also produced by Focus on the Family. The actual animation for McGee and Me was outsourced by 2 different animation studios. The first 9 episodes were outsourced by the Acom Production Company, which also outsourced for quite a few cartoons during the late 80s to 90s, including those aforementioned secular shows Mike Jones helped produce, as well as Tiny Toons Adventures, Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain, Tasmania, Earthworm Jim, Gargoyles, Batman the Animated Series, X-Men the Animated Series, and more. The last 3 episodes were outsourced by Star Toons, which was another outsourcing home for some of the 90s Warner Bros. Cartoons. You know, many of McGee and Me's fully animated segments do remind me of the classic Warner Bros. Shorts like the Looney Tunes shorts, and I definitely think that was intentional as a homage. Even the designs of the human characters from these segments have a resemblance to the human Warner Bros. Characters. This guy from the Bible passage enactment of Back at the Drawing Board looks almost exactly like the main baseball player from Baseball Bugs. Quite a coincidence for the show's animation to be outsourced by the same studios as some of the 90s Warner Bros. Cartoons. Anyway, getting back to McGee, he's hands down the most memorable character in the show, and is what I imagine most people remember the show for in the first place. He has a very Bugs Bunny-esque personality in that he's the kind of character who can get himself out of nearly any situation, using his wits and cartoony hijinks. A good showcase of this is the second animated sequence of the episode Back at the Drawing Board, where he's battling a robot named Jawbreaker. Despite being much smaller and weaker, with some slapstick, McGee manages to defeat Jawbreaker, very reminiscent of Bugs Bunny outsmarting Elmer Fudd or Yosemite Sam. Also, like Bugs Bunny, and the Looney Tunes in general, he's the kind of character who can be put into any role or any time in history, including biblical times as some of the fully animated segments showcase. I will say, however, that he doesn't always have an actual impact on the story. There are a few episodes of the show where, if McGee was removed, the story would be exactly the same and it feels like he's only tagging along. And even in most of the episodes where he does serve an actual story purpose, it's usually just giving Nick some advice or a suggestion, which Nick may or may not end up heeding. Maybe a little more could have been done to have him be more integral to the actual stories rather than just being the goofy side character, especially since he is supposed to represent Nick's conscience. By the way, given that this is a Christian show about a kid talking to someone who's not physically there, who often gives him moral advice, part of me can't help but wonder if the show was originally going to be about Nick literally talking to God, and God would tell him what to do in a given situation. But they changed this either because they thought that would be too on the nose, or because writing God that way would be considered blasphemy or something. McGee is sort of like Nick's guardian angel, even if he's no saint. No pun intended. That being said, it is hinted a few times in the show that McGee might not be imaginary. For one thing, he is able to physically interact with live-action objects, such as opening up Nick's backpack when he's inside of it, or accidentally knocking over a couple pencils in his room with a cartoon baseball. I guess it's cool they can show off a bit more of the live-action animation blending this way, but at the same time, I don't feel like an imaginary friend should be able to physically affect the real world. Personally, I would have had it so he's only able to walk around on and climb up and down things. Also, even though Nick is the only human who can see and interact with McGee, animals are apparently able to see and interact with him too, most notably the Martin's family dog, Whatever. Yes, their dog's name is Whatever. McGee even manages to scare Whatever off a couple times, like with a monster mask in A Star in the Breaking. Speaking of which, that episode also has a scene where Nick and McGee are arguing as to whether or not McGee will be coming with Nick on the game show he's going to be a contestant on. It escalates into a fight where McGee is flying around Nick's room in a World War II fighter plane and dropping cartoon explosions everywhere. On the floor below, Nick's little sister can hear the sound of missiles flying. When she goes up to Nick's door, the noise is overwhelming, but as soon as she opens the door, the noise abruptly stops and McGee's disappeared. This does fit with the idea that only Nick can see and hear McGee since he's his imaginary friend, but how could his sister hear the noise that was a result of said imaginary friend? This is just speculation, but if I had to guess why they decided to have McGee's existence outside of Nick's mind be sort of ambiguous, maybe it's because they didn't want viewers to think that Nick was schizophrenic. I mean, the show is about a kid who frequently talks to a little 6-inch tall imaginary cartoon guy after all. Maybe subtly hinting that McGee could actually be real was meant to pull people away from thinking that. Personally, I don't think I would have gotten the impression that Nick was schizophrenic. After all, plenty of kids talk a lot to their imaginary friends. Heck, as someone who has Asperger's syndrome, I talk a lot to myself all the time, and I know I'm not schizophrenic. I have a feeling that if this show was a little less niche, someone would have done a theory video about this show, asking the question of, is McGee real or just part of Nick's imagination? Also, fun fact, Ken C. Johnson, the co-creator of McGee and Me, is also the voice of McGee, as well as all the other characters from the animated segments. It's always a nice little treatment a cartoon creator voices a character on their own show, especially if it's a main character. By the way, Ken C. Johnson is actually a really great voice actor. He can do a number of distinct voices and portray the emotion of the characters he's voicing really well. I'm honestly baffled why he didn't continue voice acting after the show. I could have definitely seen him being a high-profile voice actor like Rob Paulsen or Billy West or Jeff Bennett. Okay, I've talked about McGee long enough. Let's move on to Nick's family next. We have Nick's parents, David and Elizabeth. They're basically the responsible parents who try to teach their kids right from wrong, how to live according to what Jesus says. They do love Nick and want him to do the right thing, but they will punish him if he does something wrong. Sometimes Nick ends up figuring out what to do in a certain situation after a conversation with at least one of his parents, particularly with his dad in The Big Lie. Of course, they're not completely morally perfect. There are actually 2 episodes where each of them learns the same lesson Nick does. In A Star in the Breaking, Elizabeth learns the same lesson Nick does about humility when she's excited for a job offer at a counseling center, only to find out the job is for answering the telephone. In Take Me Out of the Ball Game, David learns the same lesson Nick does about misplaced faith, but he wants Nick's baseball team to win so badly, he puts all his faith in them, forgetting that having faith in God is more important. I do like how even though Nick's parents are a good source of guidance for Nick, like their son, they're only human and aren't immune from sinning too. Then there's Nick's sisters, his older sister Sarah and his younger sister Jamie. Sarah is basically the bossy older sister who often teases her little brother and looks down at him as being less mature. Deep down though, she does genuinely love and care for Nick and wants what's best for him. Oh, and fun fact, Sarah Damon, the actress who plays Sarah, is actually the real-life older sister of Joseph Damon, the actor who plays Nick. Yeah, real-life siblings playing siblings on a show. That's pretty neat. As for Jamie, she's a curious child who looks up to both of her older siblings and wants to be like them. I'm really glad they decided not to write her as the bratty little sister trope because, yeah, that'd be both cliche and irritating. Although she does mildly annoy her family in the episode Beauty and the Beast, when she's sick in bed with the measles and is making constant demands. Then there's Nick's grandmother, who was the sole occupant of Nick's house before his immediate family moved in with her. She's a very nice elderly lady who's happy to help whenever her daughter, son-in-law, and or grandchildren need any help. She doesn't have too big of a role in the show, except for 2 episodes. The Big Lie, as well as Back to the Drawing Board, where she's the one who has a conversation with Nick about what he should do when he's facing a problem. Her first name is never given in the show, she's simply referred to as Grandma Martin in the credits, even though she's Nick's maternal grandmother and shouldn't also have the last name Martin. Finally, wrapping up the Martin family, there's Whatever, the pet dog who often gets into things that he shouldn't. Also, like I said before, Whatever is somehow able to perceive and interact with McGee just like Nick. As for Nick's friends, we have Louis, Nick's best friend. Well, best live-action friend, that is. He's basically the smooth-talking, smart-aleck kind of kid who sometimes gets Nick into trouble, like when he tells some other kids at school about Nick's supposed encounter with George Ravenhill, or when he convinces Nick to sneak out and see a horror movie that his parents forbade him from watching. Still, he does try to be a good friend to Nick and also seems to have faith issues. By the way, despite his name being pronounced Louis, it's spelled like Louis. In the episode Take Me Out of the Ball Game, the first episode where we see Louis's parents, they're given the last name Armstrong in the credits, making Louis's name a pun on jazz musician Louis Armstrong. Then there's Renee Johnson. She's a girl in Nick's friend group. On some level, she is kind of the token girl, given that she's not quite as fleshed out as some of the other secondary cast. Although she's not totally one-dimensional, she is shown to be a good student and has the ability to make clever quips and comebacks to the school bully. More on the school bully later. However, there's also something else about Renee that makes her rather interesting. In the episode Twister and Shout, it's revealed that Renee's parents are divorced. She lives with her mother in Eastfield while her father lives in California. Renee's mother, Carol, even says that she hasn't prayed in a while. I'll be honest, I'm actually a little surprised the show decided to showcase divorce. Not because I think that representing the reality of divorced parents in kids shows isn't important, it is, but, and I apologize if me continuously bring this up as getting annoying, this is a Christian show. You'd think a Christian show would ignore divorce and pretend the nuclear family is the only type of family that exists. After all, the Bible says that marriage should be between one man and one woman for life. Showcasing divorce seems a little surprising for a show with this aspect to it. Plus, in the early 90s, many TV executives were still squeamish about directly showcasing divorce on kids shows. The show seems to have had balls for directly showcasing it. By the way, in case you're wondering, no, this show doesn't have any gay characters in it. Beyond the fact that the show's from the late 80s, early 90s, and gay people still look quite a way to go in terms of acceptance, showcasing homosexuality in a Christian show in any regard, positively or negatively, would have definitely pissed someone off. Not to mention the focus on the family, the organization that funded the show, is known for having very homophobic views. But I digress. Renee's father, Ted, does eventually appear in the episode In the Nick of Time, where Nick, his friends, and their fathers are going mountain climbing in California for their summer vacation. Ted keeps trying to give his daughter constant advice and tells her what to do to the point of annoyance. Obviously, since he's been away from his daughter for some time, he's trying to catch up on all the advice giving he never gave her since he and her mother divorced. Eventually, he learns to stop with all the constant advice giving and lets her do her own thing, accepting the fact that his daughter needs to be independent. Just because he's been away from his daughter's life for a while doesn't mean he has to be constantly involved in it now. We actually do get a touching father-to-daughter bonding moment between the two of them here.
And let's see. Don't ride with anybody who hasn't had their license for at least 2 years. Remember, don't go to the mall.
Please stop.
Yeah, I know, honey. I'm going awfully fast, but I'm not with you for very much time, and I have so
Daddy?
much I want you to remember.
Daddy, I'll always remember this is the best vacation I ever had. And I'll remember that you love me a whole lot.
With all my heart.
You don't have to start telling me all of the don'ts, because you spent 10 years teaching me all the right do's.
Oh, it's just so hard, honey. I'm so far away. I just want to be with you. I want to protect you.
I miss you too. But the things you taught come back to me, and it's like you're still there. Almost.
Wrapping up Nick's friends, there's Philip Monroe. He's basically the class nerd, the smart wimpy kid who frequently gets picked on. At first, he's only a tertiary character and doesn't have that big of a role in the show, except for the episode Skate Expectations where Nick stands up for Philip when he's getting bullied. Later on in the show, however, he ends up joining Nick's inner circle of friends. Also, fun fact, Whitby Hertford, his actor, is the real-life brother of Chelsea Hertford, the actress who plays Nick's sister Jamie. There's also one more character on the show who's a friend of Nick, but I'll talk about them later. As for the other characters that have at least 2 appearances, there's the elementary school faculty. We have Mrs. Harmon, Nick's teacher. She's generally a kind teacher, although she does have a sarcastic side to her as well. There's Coach Slater, the gym coach, who's generally tough and cold-hearted. He actually fills in as a substitute for Mrs. Harmon in A Star in the Breaking. There's Mr. Oliver, the very kind and patient school principal. He appears in A Star in the Breaking when he comes to Nick's class to congratulate him for getting selected to appear in a game show, as well as the show's Christmas episode, 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas, where he's talking to Mrs. Harmon about the school bully Derek having problems at home. Speaking of which, we have Derek Kreider. Derek is a stereotypical grade school bully character. The big kid who often picks on and beats up kids weaker than him, is a year older than everyone else in his class due to having repeated a grade, has a gang known as his dorks that's pretty much never seen without him, etc. And of course, since Nick is the main character, he's the one we see Derek picking on the most, usually by threatening him or calling him Squid. Yeah, you can name plenty of similar bully characters in plenty of other shows. However, major spoilers here. In the episode 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas, Derek ends up performing and stops being a bully. In that episode, Derek, along with Nick and Lewis, are casted as the 3 wise men in the school's Christmas pageant, which takes place on Christmas Eve. Derek is completely apathetic and doesn't want to be in the pageant at all. Nick notices that he seems to be in an even more sour mood than usual and wonders what's going on. While at a shop examining the Christmas gift he's going to buy for his mother, Nick sees 3 guys hanging out there. They're caught shoplifting and are scolded by the shop owner, who calls them thieves and tells them not to come back. Right as they walk out, Nick notices that one of them is Derek. Nick becomes even more suspicious about Derek, which is only exacerbated when Derek stops showing up to rehearsals and he overhears Mrs. Harmon and Mr. Oliver's conversation about him. McGee suggests that Nick visit Derek at his home. When Nick does so, he discovers the reason why Derek is a bully in the first place. He has an abusive father and is recruited by a gang leader named Ray, who's even bigger and tougher than he is. Derek is initially annoyed that Nick came to see him, but Nick reminds Derek of what Christmas is all about and how nobody should be feeling down around this time of year. After being shown this bit of kindness, Derek begins to have a change of heart. He does eventually perform as the 3rd wise man in the Christmas pageant and decides he wants out of Ray's gang. Ray tells Derek that if he ever sees him or Nick again, it's over for Derek. After the pageant, while Nick is walking home with his mother's Christmas gift, Ray spots him while he and his other gang member, whom Nick saw with Derek and Ray at the shop, are driving down the street. He gets out of the car and pushes Nick into an alley, but before he can do anything else to him, someone jumps in and fights Ray off, saving Nick's life. That someone, as is revealed, is Derek.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Why did you... I don't understand.
I don't really know either. Maybe I'm just starting to see things different. I gotta go.
Derek. Thanks.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Derek's reformation isn't just a one-off thing. He literally does change after this episode. In fact, in the show's penultimate episode, The Blunder Years, Derek ends up being the voice of reason for Nick. Not McGee, not his family, not any of his live-action friends. Derek is the one who has a pivotal conversation with Nick when he's doing the wrong thing. And sure, the bully / bad guy / antagonist performance trope isn't totally original, but I do feel like it's done effectively here. Also, Christian show, salvation, second chance from God. I feel like it does make some sort of conceptual sense to have the show's main antagonist be redeemed. By the way, that scene from 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas, from Nick walking down the street with his mother's Christmas gift to Derek revealing himself to Nick after fighting Ray, is easily the most dramatic the show has ever gotten. The show can be serious when it needs to. There are a few scenes in the show where Nick has an "oh crap, I screwed up" moment, having learned his lesson the hard way, and has to sit with it. The pivotal conversation he often has in many episodes where he realizes what he needs to do or what he's already done are also mildly emotional. Of course, it never gets too heavy. This is a kid's show after all. But these moments do make you sympathize with Nick and make you feel for what's happened. It doesn't just tell you how Nick is feeling when he screws up or is facing a difficulty. It shows you. The show can also have other dramatic moments, like in Twister and Shout when everyone's afraid of the impending tornado, or In the Nick of Time where... well, I won't spoil what happens, but that episode also has a dramatic climax. I think the scene in The Big Lie when Nick arrives at George Ravenhill's house only to see what Derek and his gang did is the second most heart-wrenching scene in the entire show. Okay, that is a genuinely fantastic scene. It's over a minute of no dialogue whatsoever. The emotional scene is carried through the sight of George Ravenhill's ransacked house, the looks on the characters' faces, and the score. Nick feels the weight of the guilt he carries since what happened was indirectly his fault, and is now thinking, oh no, what have I done? It is clear that the show does genuinely care about writing and telling an effective story, not just spoon-feeding kids a moral or religious lesson. Of course, the show isn't emotional all the time. It does know how to balance the serious with the silly, usually the wacky and cartoony bits with McGee in the fully animated sequences. The show also can be funny at times. While not a comedy, at least not for the most part, this show does have its humorous moments, and I'm not just referring to the animated bits. Occasionally, there is a funny or witty loud dialogue with a chuckle. Here are a few of my favorite funny lines from the show.
Did you all pick out a book for your reports?
I've got my book, Mrs. Harmon.
Pretty and popular. The Modern Girl's Guide to Good Looks. Well, I'll be interested in reading what you have to write on the subject.
What are you gonna wear?
Forget the clothes. What's my share of the prize money?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I don't think they're gonna let you do that on TV, do you?
Why was Derek picking on you?
Don't tell Miss Harmon, but he's making me give him the answers to the geography quiz.
Figures. I guess he can't handle big words like Ohio.
The number for the banquet hall is?
On the refrigerator.
And the number for Dr. Walters is?
On the refrigerator.
And if anybody calls us, you tell them that we are
on the refrigerator.
Okay, first word. Aluminum.
The word was aluminum, but I sure wasn't gonna tell him.
Inventions. Like the time he told me to use Mom's vacuum cleaner to rake the leaves.
Yeah, it would have worked if you hadn't hit the sprinkler.
There was this giant grizzly. He must have been 10 feet tall. He wanted my sugarless candy.
Oh, well, there you go. At least you have the satisfaction of knowing that you're promoting good dental hygiene among the local bear population, Phil.
D?
What does the wise man say?
What? That's wise man, not wise guy.
Also, another funny scene I want to highlight is a scene from Back to the Drawing Board where Nick is expressing his frustration about a new kid in class who's better at drawing than he is, and is denying being jealous despite obviously being jealous. Meanwhile, McGee is being snarky and sarcastic to Nick's denial of jealousy, and is playing the world's smallest violin. Literally and figuratively. On the topic of music, the show also contains a handful of original songs. Every single episode of the show barring one has an original song in it, although it's not the same deal as silly songs with Larry from VeggieTales or any other songs that characters in VeggieTales sang. With one exception, I'll talk about that later, these songs are non-diegetic, songs that aren't actually playing in the world of the show but the audience can hear. These songs are usually played at or around the climax of the story, and they always relate to the moral of the episode.
Love never lies. Love never lies. No matter what you may have done, no matter when or why, there's never any reason the truth won't get you by. Stand up, do what you have to do. Stay tough, 'cause you're gonna make it through. It gets rough, but you can be sure if you give it your best, you're gonna pass the test. No matter the cost, you'll never give it up. You gotta stand up, step by step, one step at a time. Step by step, never looking behind. There's no way to go but up and over the hill. Just step by step.
The purpose of most of these songs is to highlight what's going through Nick's mind when he learns the moral and is now doing what he needs to do. These songs do their job well and work within the story. Some of the songs are slow and emotional, while others are more upbeat and happy sounding. I especially like the Calypso song from Do the Bright Thing. I'm not sure why they decided to make this a Calypso song. The episode isn't about the Martins taking a trip to Jamaica or something, but damn if it isn't catchy. Under the Sea from The Little Mermaid is still a catchier Calypso song though. The show also has a really great theme song. It has a really catchy melody and an awesome new wave sound to it. It's instrumental, but it doesn't need any lyrics. Despite the fact that it's a bit long for a theme song, being a minute and a half long, I don't mind at all. It sounds great. So yeah, like VeggieTales, this is another Christian kids show that has a pretty good soundtrack, and while these songs aren't quite as memorable as those in VeggieTales, they are still pretty good. Jim Koval, like Kurt Heineke, knows how to make some solid music. The only episode without an original song is 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas. To be honest though, that episode didn't really need an original song, and I'm glad they didn't try to add one in regardless. By the way, I'm really glad that the plot of the show's Christmas episode wasn't Nick puts a bunch of items on his Christmas list and is excited about getting everything he wants, but in the end, he's reminded that Christmas is really about Jesus' birth and not getting presents because, yeah, that would have been the obvious Christmas episode plot to right here. Also, for a bit of time, 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas was the final episode of McGee and Me. Ending the show with a heartwarming holiday episode definitely felt like a perfect send-off. Well, that was before 3 more episodes were made. The last 3 episodes of the show came out in 1993, about 2.5 years after 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas. I've already spoken a bit about these 3 episodes here and there, but I do want to talk about them as a whole separately because there is something about these final 3 episodes that sets them apart from the first 9. These episodes were released under the show name The New Adventures of McGee and Me. They also have a brand new title sequence and are set several months after the first 9 episodes. I can't help but draw parallels between this and Nickelodeon Doug versus Disney's Doug. In both these shows' cases, after the original run wrapped up, it was brought back about 2.5 years later, as a revival/continuation for the original, with some additional changes to it. While the first 9 episodes feature Nick toward the end of elementary school, in The New Adventures, he enters into junior high. Although due to being filmed a few years after the first run wrapped up, Nick looks more like a high schooler due to Joseph Damon having aged during the hiatus. All of the main secondary cast reprise their roles for The New Adventures, with the exception of those who played the elementary school faculty, obviously, as well as Brent Kelly, who did not return to play Lewis. Lewis is actually written off the show in The New Adventures, and I'm not really sure why. Lewis is mentioned in the final episode, Beauty and the Beast, when Nick talks about how he's planning on sleeping over with him in Indianapolis, where it's implied his family moved to see a football game with him there, although those plans fall through. Nick also talks to him over the phone in that episode, although we don't see or hear Lewis. In The New Adventures, Lewis is replaced by a new character named Jordan. Jordan is an athletic student who plays on the Eastville Junior High football team and is also into computer graphics. Fun fact, Jordan is played by Sonny Kelly, the real-life brother of Brent Kelly, who played Lewis. For those counting, that's 3 pairs of real-life siblings who are actors on the show. Also, just like Lewis, Jordan's name is a reference to a famous person. His name is Jordan Michaels. Between that and the fact that he's an athlete, that's a reference to... well, that should be obvious. You know, there is something about The New Adventures that does feel a little different from the original run. It's hard for me to pin it down exactly, but I just can't help but feel like there's something that the original run had that was missing from The New Adventures. In addition to things I already mentioned, there were a few other little changes here and there that made these last 3 episodes feel more separate from the first 9. First of all, the openings of most episodes where Nick reads a passage from the Bible before the story begins are completely absent from the new adventures. We just go straight into the story right away. I guess this was done to make more room for actual story, but I like those opening segments. Not only do they help to bookend the episode, since they always foreshadow the moral that Nick would learn by the end of the story, and introduced us to the show's title character, but I also feel like they set the show's tone. They showcase right up front this show contains cartoony animation in addition to live action, as well as the religiosity and the insights of Nick's mind, all of which are important aspects of the show. While these 3 episodes do each have a character read a Bible verse around the beginning of the story, relating to the episode's moral, it's not quite the same thing. The only 2 episodes from the first round that didn't have a Bible passage reading from Nick before the story began were Do the Bright Thing and 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas. Though given that those were the Formula Breaker episode and the Christmas episode respectively, I can forgive those. Plus, both those episodes did still start out with a fully animated segment before the story. It is a bit of a shame that they removed these. I do feel like these were a highlight of the show. It means we get 1 fewer fully animated segment than we would have in the original run. Something else that felt a little off about the new adventures, well, besides the fact that a teenager in junior high still talks to his imaginary friend, is that it doesn't feel quite as timeless as the original run. Now sure, there are a handful of things in the first 9 episodes that you could argue are a bit out of date by today's standards, or indicate that the show is from the late 80s, early 90s, like some of the technology we see, or the kids at school calling George Ravenhill an Indian as opposed to a Native American, or the game show Nick goes on clearly being inspired by Double Dare, which was a very popular game show at the time. For the most part though, I feel like the stories and morals the first 9 episodes told do still hold up to this day. The way an episode like The Big Lie tells the story of a kid who learns that you should always tell the truth makes it work for any time or generation. Heck, the way that episode dispels a rumor laced with harmful stereotypes of Native Americans almost makes that episode feel ahead of its time. Meanwhile, I feel like there are some aspects of the new adventures that do make it feel dated to the 90s. In the show's new title sequence, McGee flies across Nick's room and crashes into a computer, and the title and opening credits are written in CGI text and flying on a background that looks like a 90s desktop wallpaper. I'm sure back in 1993 that looked cool, but in 2023, 30 years later, it looks pretty dated. Also, even though they didn't completely replace the theme music like with Disney's Doug, they did update it by giving it more of a 90s sort of sound. But that's not the worst offender of the new adventures feeling dated to the 90s. That would be the episode The Blunder Years, which in my opinion is the worst episode of the whole show. The episode is about Nick being taken under the wing of Rex Rogers, the coolest guy at Eastfield Junior High, who teaches Nick how to also be cool. Right off the bat, that's already a plot that's probably going to make the episode feel dated, since what's cool changes all the time. Well, that's exactly the case here. Not only does the dialogue contain a ton of slang, mostly from Rex, but the episode is also littered with these guitar stings. These guitar stings also make it pretty obvious this episode came out in the 90s. The subplot of the episode is that Nick's parents are hosting the 25th annual Battle of the Bands at Eastfield Junior High, a tradition they began back when they attended Eastfield Junior High. When they go to the event, they're dressed in 60s attire. Again, this also makes the episode feel dated because this only makes sense for kids whose parents went to junior high in the 60s. Not to mention that we never saw Nick's parents wear 60s attire before, or even make reference to what decade it was when they were Nick's age. I like the fact that they didn't, since it made the stories from the original run work for kids of any time, but not here. There are also a couple other things about this episode that make it feel like it misunderstands the show conceptually. First of all, this is the only episode of the show that doesn't have any fully animated segments. Since this is from the new adventures, the Bible passage enactment by McGee before the story is gone, but the second fully animated segment is missing here too. Even the other 2 episodes from the new adventures had a fully animated segment. The only animation we see in this episode is with McGee in the live-action environment. The use of animation in addition to live action is a big part of the show's identity, so the omission of any fully animated segment here is just baffling. Secondly, this is the only episode of the show where the original song is diegetic. In other words, playing in the world of the show. Spoiler alert for the end of this episode. After Nick has a pivotal conversation about what he now needs to do, the Battle of the Bands begins. When the first band comes in and plays their song, the lyrics just so happen to spell out the episode's moral. Only after hearing that song does Nick realize his mistake, and he decides to stop being cool and go back to his old friends. Having the song actually be played in the world of the show and literally tell Nick what he's done wrong makes it feel like he didn't actually do anything to learn the moral for himself. He didn't show any kind of regret or remorse for what he'd done until the Battle of the Bands started. Plus, why did it take till then for him to realize his mistake? Shouldn't the pivotal conversation have been enough? Imagine if in The Big Lie, after having his conversation with his dad, Nick still didn't know if he should have told the truth about George Ravenhill, but after hearing someone in the show sing a song about telling the truth, then he realized what he needed to do. That's honestly what this feels like. It misses the point of what the purpose of the songs were in all the other episodes. It was to show the audience how Nick was feeling, not tell him what to do. The moral here just doesn't feel very compelling. And sure, learn to be yourself, and that's more important to have real friends and to be cool is a good moral to learn, but the way it's presented in this episode is just weak and makes it not work for any time other than the 90s. When Saberspark briefly brought up McGee and Me in his What Ruined VeggieTales video, which by the way is a fantastic video that you should seriously go watch, he said that he saw an episode of it and that it was the most 1990s show ever made. I have a strong feeling that the episode he saw was The Blunder Years because, yeah, this episode definitely feels the most like it's from the 90s. It's really disappointing because, again, the first 9 episodes of this show, for the most part, felt relatively timeless. This episode just doesn't. Between everything I said about being stuck in the 90s, as well as the fact that it's the only episode of the show without a fully animated segment, and where the original song is diegetic, it just doesn't fit in with the rest of the show at all. This is the only episode of the show that I don't recommend. If I could say one good thing about this episode, I think the scene where Nick breaks off his friendship with McGee is actually pretty effective.
You're out of control. That half her brains has made you somebody else. You're bagging on your family and all your friends, too.
Well, hang it up, McGee. Yeah, whoever gave you the right to tell me what to do?
Well, I'm your best friend.
I'm not so sure of that anymore.
Draw me some Q-tips. I thought I heard you say, we're not friends anymore?
You did. Rex was right. Drawing cartoons are uncool for a guy my age. Cartoons are for kids.
Say it ain't so, kid. Say it ain't so.
Just go away. All right, leave me alone, McGee.
I'm not gonna lie, that's actually a pretty good scene that emphasizes how being cool ended up straining Nick's relationship with his friends and made him someone he's not. Though again, it would have been nice if he realized his mistake sooner than he actually did. In addition to feeling more dated, the New Adventures also has a lot more lines referencing pop culture than the original run. Now sure, sometimes there was an occasional line of dialogue from the first 9 episodes that had a minor pop culture reference, and there definitely were pop culture parodies with McGee in the fully animated segments, but it just feels off to hear some of the New Adventures casually mention Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, or Ken and Barbie, or Indiana Jones. These lines just feel unnecessary, and they do kind of put me off, since there weren't really any lines like these in the first 9 episodes. Unlike all the Wizard of Oz references in Twister and Shout, they don't have any meaningful relation to the story. They feel like they're just here for the sake of referencing pop culture. It's hard to explain, but it just feels like whoever wrote these lines misunderstood something about the show's universe that was already established from the original run. I don't think these changes were unintentional. I think there is a reason for why they happened. One thing I noticed between the original run and the New Adventures is that the show's co-creators seem to have had less creative involvement in the latter. 6 out of the original 9 episodes were written or co-written by Ken and or Bill. Ken was also the supervising producer of animation for the first 9 episodes. In the New Adventures, while they're still credited as the creators and Ken is still the voice of McGee and the other characters in the fully animated segments, that seems to be about all the involvement they had. They didn't have a hand in writing any of the last 3 episodes or of any other credits. This is just speculation, but it very much looks like the New Adventures only exist due to an executive who wanted to keep the show going and ended up meddling in the show in a few ways to make it more hip, while the creators, who had a lot more creative control at the beginning, now had very little, but nonetheless continued to work on the show but in a less creatively involved way. That's not too dissimilar to what happened to the other Christian kid show I've mentioned numerous times in this video. Go watch Saberspark's What Ruined VeggieTales video if you want to know more about that. Okay, I've been a bit harsh toward the New Adventures. I do want to clarify here that I don't think these last 3 episodes are bad. Even the Blunder Years I consider to be more mediocre than bad. In fact, I actually think In the Nick of Time, the first episode of the New Adventures, is actually among the top 5 best episodes of the whole show. I do, however, think the New Adventures misses the mark of being a great revival / continuation of the show in a few ways. Personally, I found myself coming back to the first 9 episodes of the show more than the final 3. Again, it's like Nickelodeon Doug versus Disney's Doug. While the latter isn't absolutely awful or even really that bad, the former is easily the superior version. If there is anything that I think the New Adventures of McGee and Me did do better than the original run, it was giving the animation a slightly more polished look. The movements of McGee and the other characters in the fully animated segments look a bit smoother and the colors were brightened up a little. I mean, if there was anything that should have been updated from the original run, it was definitely the animation quality. These slight changes with the animation can be partially attributed to switching outsourcing homes from Acom Productions to StarToons between the original run and the New Adventures. Just like the original run, the New Adventures also ended with a heartwarming holiday episode, as Beauty and the Beast was the show's Thanksgiving episode. Surprisingly, this Christian show didn't have an Easter episode. I wonder what an Easter episode of the show would have been like. However, this still wasn't the end for McGee and Me. The very last thing made for the show was a special called McGee TV Out of Control, released in 1995. In the special, McGee gets his own TV network, aptly titled McGee TV.
From Hollywood, California, it's the premiere of McGee TV!
If that announcer voice sounds familiar to you, that's Townsend Coleman, aka The Tick, Michelangelo from the 1987 TMNT show, Scott Howard from the Teen Wolf animated series, and plenty of other animated characters. The special is basically just a compilation of most of the fully animated segments from the show, many of them slightly re-edited. In between those segments, we get some new CGI animated segments with voiceover from the announcer, and occasionally some banter between him and McGee. These CGI segments segue into the next 2D animated segment from the show, some of them in a very non sequitur way.
Life got you down? Well, folks, we've got the answer. It's the full-featured single, double, triple drive unit that makes your CD-ROM CD right. It's super powered interactive chip. Activates the McGee Computer Bible. All designed to help you CD right from ROM. As part of the program, you'll be able to run zip time movies. Here's an actual example.
Never forget to be truthful and kind. Hold these virtues tightly.
By the way, I hope you like 90s CGI, because you're going to get quite a bit of that here. I guess I shouldn't have expected it to look like Pixar, but considering the special came out the same year as Toy Story, it's hard not to make that comparison. To be honest, I didn't really like the special that much. If you've seen all the show's actual episodes, then you've seen all the 2D animated segments featured here, so there's really not much reason to watch this. Honestly, even by clip show standards, this feels really half-assed. We don't even get new animated segments with McGee. I would have at least expected to see some wraparound segments where we see McGee coming onto a stage and introducing each new animated segment to an in-show audience, sort of like America's Funniest Home Videos. Instead, all we get is some new voiceover from McGee. The scenes where he's supposedly at the control center working the network are just recycled segments of him working Nick's mind's control panel from Do the Bright Thing, some of which have McGee's new voiceover dubbed over top. And that's not the only case of new voiceover being dubbed over the show's previous animated segments.
It's a beautiful afternoon here in Eastfield, Indiana for opening day. Next up to bat, well, it looks like McGee is leaving the dugout and headed for home plate.
He's picked out his favorite bat. McGee's had a tremendous preseason average this year.
It's clear this is made pretty cheaply. Plus, there's no real story or conflict here, unless you consider McGee TV occasionally going off the air and McGee trying to fix it to be conflict. Honestly, I don't really see any point in watching this. Sure, it is a bit cool to hear Townsend Coleman as the announcer, and to be fair, we do get some new segments in this, but I don't really feel like it's enough to justify its existence. Unless you're a hardcore McGee and Me fan, I'd skip this. This really felt like a last-ditch effort to keep the show relevant. A new episode hadn't come out in a year and a half by this point, and they couldn't really make any new episodes anymore. By this point, the kid actors are grown too old to play their parts, and replacing them with new kids just wouldn't feel right. I suppose there is a way they could have kept the McGee and Me franchise going after this. I could have seen a fully animated spin-off show starring McGee working. Not only would that have expanded on the fully animated segments we saw from the original show, but that could have definitely lasted for longer since they wouldn't have to worry about kid actors growing up. However, around this time, a certain other Christian kid show was rising in popularity and would soon overshadow McGee and Me. It seemed right about now was a good time to end the show, which is exactly what happened. 12 episodes and one special later, it was finally time to say goodbye to this cool cartoon conscience. Overall, despite having one episode that feels incredibly dated and out of place from the rest of the show, and concluding with a half-assed clip show, I think McGee and Me was pretty good. The writing is solid, the morals for the most part are well told, the lessons are relatable, the animation is fun, the religious aspect isn't intrusive, and it's overall enjoyable. Honestly, regardless of your religion or lack thereof, I definitely think you'll find something to like about this show. My fellow cartoon community members will definitely enjoy the animated bits and find it cool to know that it was outsourced by the same studios as a few other 90s cartoons. Plus, most of these morals do work for secular audiences as well. With some tweaking, McGee and Me could have been a secular show. In fact, I have a hunch that if McGee and Me was a secular show and aired on a kids channel or programming block instead of being a direct-to-video series, Defunct Clan might have already done a Defunct TV episode on it by now. If VeggieTales could gain a secular audience, I don't see why McGee and Me couldn't have. As for why it didn't gain a secular audience, I guess it was really only discussed in Christian circles in the early 90s. It was just too niche for anyone else to care. Not to mention that VeggieTales overshadowing it as the biggest Christian kids show also definitely played a role in the show fading into semi-obscurity. Though that's not to say it didn't leave behind any sort of marker impact. The show was positively received when it came out, and even a couple secular publications, namely the Chicago Tribune and Entertainment Weekly, praised the show. George Tawil, one of the show's producers, actually won the Michelangelo Award for the show at the 12th Annual Young Artist Awards. Additionally, the actors of Nick, Sarah, Jamie, Renee, and Philip were nominated for Outstanding Youth Mini Video Series for the episode In the Nick of Time at the 15th Annual Young Artist Awards, although they didn't win. Unfortunately, it seems that most of the actors in the show don't have too many other notable roles besides the show. Most of them don't even have Wikipedia pages. Also, not so fun fact, Joseph Damon, who played Nick, ended up becoming an alcoholic and a drug addict as an adult. That's not too dissimilar to what happened to a lot of other child stars, unfortunately. Thankfully, he's not an addict anymore. He has sobered up and recovered from his addiction, which is definitely good. I'm certainly glad God helped him overcome that. Maybe some advice from McGee could have stopped him from going down that path in the first place. Despite not really having any notable actors as the main cast, the show did actually manage to get a couple of notable guest stars. These include Dick Van Patten, who played Graham the art store owner in Do the Bright Thing, and former Los Angeles Dodgers pitcher Oral Hershiser, who played himself in Nick's Daydream in Take Me Out of the Ball Game. Even despite being funded by a private Christian organization as opposed to a TV network, the show did seem to have a decent budget. Certainly enough to get these guest stars on it and feature animation in every episode. Animation is expensive to make. All 12 episodes of the show were also released as books concurrently with the show, which were also sold in Christian bookstores. I've never read any of those books. This review is solely focused on the show, but it seems to be the same story as the episodes in book form. If you've read any of those books yourself, let me know if there's any notable change between each book and its respective episode. Personally, I didn't grow up with McGee and Me the same way I grew up with VeggieTales, probably because the show was over before I was even born. Heck, my parents weren't even married yet when the first episode came out. Although my mom did tell me that we might have actually owned a DVD copy of one episode at one point, but we don't own it anymore. The show seems to have gone out of print, and as far as I know, it's not currently hosted on any streaming service. Unless you're okay with paying for expensive secondhand VHS or DVD copies online, this seems to be one of those shows you have to pirate in order to watch. Thankfully, the whole show is available online, and I'm glad I was able to watch it again. That scanned memory of seeing the title sequence at church was basically all I could recall about the show before I rewatched it. I'm glad I got to check it out again, and I also hope I can bring it into the minds of others. I mean, if Little Dogs on the Prairie can finally get some notoriety from a secular audience years later, who would say this underrated Christian kid show can too? If you're a Christian or a fan of VeggieTales, then I absolutely recommend McGee and Me. As for anyone else, as long as you're not the kind of person who gets uncomfortable by explicit religious references in media, then I'd recommend you check it out too. On a scale of 1 to 10, I give this a thumbs up. More specifically, a 7 out of 10. And hey, this just goes to show, sometimes that show or movie you have an incredibly scant memory of that you saw so long ago really is worth remembering. If an opportunity does come for you to check it out again for so long, don't let it pass you by. Who knows, it might just be an underrated gem. But I want to hear from you. Have you seen McGee and Me? If so, what do you think of it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Did you agree or disagree with anything I said in this review? For anyone who's never seen the show, did I interest you in checking it out? Do you have any scam memories of some show or movie from years ago that you either haven't seen since or didn't rediscover until years later? Let me know in the comments. You know, this actually makes me wonder, what other early 90s Christian media is out there?
Hey, Scotty. Jesus, man.
Oh, right. What else?
God is doing a new thing in our lives, Lord. We're doing a new thing through Jesus Christ. Doing a new thing through our
I'll see you all
music.
later.
We're doing a new thing so he can use it.